I'm joined by my colleague at the Inquirer, columnist David Murphy, to talk about the A.J. Brown trade that finally happened. No big surprise, unless you've been living under a rock or you're one of these Eagles fans that's just kind of stuck your head in the clouds or fingers in your ears and just kind of attacked me every time I mentioned the possibility or reported on what was happening behind the scenes. But Dave, I guess, first off, initial reaction to the news.
Well, I actually think you hit on something there. And it's funny because I remember I kind of flash back to the 3 or 4 times that I've been on this podcast, and I feel like AJ it's been going on that long, and we've kind of followed the evolution, I think, of everybody where, at first it clearly didn't make sense to do it during the season, but by a certain point, there's a momentum to these things, and it was obvious to anybody who has followed this stuff long enough that AJ was on the way out. I mean, there gets to be a point where if both parties aren't trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube actively, you can assume that it's out the tube for a reason, And I think that, it's interesting. If we had not had that entire build up to this thing and the city of Philadelphia at 4:00 on June 1st suddenly was hit with the news that the Eagles were trading A.J. Brown, I think the reaction would be a lot different than it is right now, where people have kind of accepted the fact that he's not going to be here and have kind of talked themselves into rationalizing that or I don't know what the proper word is and focused on the return. But that's a long-winded way of saying that I think we've kind of flipped the script now and got to a point where, I think the consensus opinion is dramatically underestimating the impact of not having A.J. Brown in this offense. I think that he clearly was not the same guy last year, but he was still a guy that the Eagles will not have. And that was a huge part of this offense, and I think that it's going to be the huge weight on Jalen Hurts' shoulders right now to show that he can play quarterback in the NFL without having a top, 12 to 15 receiver of all time as a safety blanket.
Which I think is, which leads to the question of when you look at the compensation that they got in return, because that's really the big news of the day. Although, I had heard for quite a while that it was going to be a first rounder. It's in some year. Just wasn't sure which one it was until recently. It was, seemed to be heading into 2028 direction, at least in terms of how the information was relayed to me. As far as I can understand, though, the parameters of this deal have been in place since before the 2026 draft. But, to those listening, they're going to get a 2028 first rounder from the Patriots, along with a 2027 fifth rounder, which I understand was kind of like a sweetener that was thrown in at the end. Hey, let's just get this over the finish line. I think Howie wanted a little more in return. And then the Patriots are like, all right, fine. Mike Vrabel doesn't really care about a third-day draft pick. But
he's got bigger fish to fry right now.
Right. But the question is, I think that a lot of fans are probably going to have is like, okay, why do we have to wait 2 years to see the return for A.J. Brown? Now, there's so much more involved in what the Eagles are getting in terms of cap relief, cash down the road, $133.1 million in terms of how much they are slated to pay. They were slated to pay A.J. Brown. And, there won't be much cap from savings these next 2 years. In fact, there'll be a $43 million dead money hit, and which now they can spread out over 2 years because it's post June 1. And that had a lot to do with why they waited until after the 2026 draft to do this trade. Beat reporters did speak with Howie Roseman not long after the trade was announced. And, his answer to that was essentially, okay, or at least from what I understand, 2026 wasn't considered a great draft. The teams that you're dealing with, essentially, because A.J. Brown's wishes are factored into the equation, and, lesser teams probably don't have the wherewithal to move first rounders so far in advance. So you're kind of limiting the pool of teams that you're talking to, was why 2026 wasn't really actually what they wanted. They were okay with the future picks. That being said, why not a 2027? Everyone's looking at that draft to be extremely deep, very talented. And, I think there are a couple of things that factored into that, but I think it's a fair question. And I think when you look at the Jalen Waddle trade, if you're looking for a comp, they got like a 2026 first rounder, third rounder, fourth rounder, and the Dolphins got in return from the Broncos, Waddle and a fourth rounder. So that's a lot more. Again, that's the 2026 draft versus a future one. But, if you're going into this, and from what I understand, Howie was asking for like a first and a second, and you only end up with a first and a fifth, And AJ Brown is considered better than Jalen Waddle. I think leaps and bounds better, if you ask me. I know he's 19 months younger. Why didn't they get kind of ample compensation or comparable compensation in return?
Yeah, so I've been kind of, I've kind of been in the minority and people kind of projecting this draft value where I was wondering if they would even get a first that wasn't conditional or something like that. You
Yeah,
know, and that's mostly because I think, look, these teams, they all have access to the same data, right? They have, obviously the Patriots don't have the RFID data from Eagles practice sessions, but they know exactly how fast guys are running, how high they're jumping, how they compare to what they were 2 or 3 years ago. And while that they guard that data with their life, and I have not seen it, I would suspect that it matches what we've seen a little bit with our eyes. I know that going back a year, there are people who have thought that AJ was slowing a half a step. Don't get me wrong. It's not to say that it's not to say that they sold a bill of goods to the Patriots, but I think that they were nervous about how he would age over these next 2 or 3 years. And I think other teams, I'm sure, are looking at the same thing. I mean, 19 months in football years, especially when you have a frame, with the BMI of AJ Brown, Waddle's more of a live guy. Look, you can't predict injuries, but just in terms of how a body ages, power players like AJ Brown, look at Julio Jones. Once it goes, it starts to go, and it goes fast, and you can be stuck holding the bag, you know. That's not to say I think the Eagles were trying desperately to get out from AJ before that happened. I just think it factored into it, and I think that while Jalen Waddle next season, previous seasons will never come close to what AJ Brown was at his peak. I don't know how many teams were actually thinking they were trading for AJ Brown at his peak. Like this wasn't Devontae Adams going to the Raiders. This was Devontae Adams going to the Rams. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if around the league that was more kind of the conventional wisdom.
Well, you bring up the Rams, and they were involved in in trade negotiations with the Eagles, and reportedly, and from what I understand, I've confirmed that as well. That they had gotten the medicals, had asked for the medicals of AJ, and that kind of they weren't satisfied with what they saw, and that was sort of why they backed out. So that explains why AJ's value on the market. Partly, I think, explains why his value wasn't what you might have thought it would be. And my guess is the Eagles, this is, if you're looking for reasons why the Eagles have done this beyond all the money that they're saving in the future and getting back to first rounder, as you mentioned, it's not just the speed thing, whatever. I don't know how you quantify that, but it's also this potentially, what am I understand, these chronic knees that have been kind of hanging over him. They kind of the part of the reason why he dropped into the second round in the draft, and he's had various bumps and bruises over the years. He hasn't he hasn't played the full season. I think he did maybe once or twice. He's missed time. He's never missed an extensive, a huge amount of time. So I don't really worry about his durability. And I asked Howie Roseman this question specifically about the knee and about the Rams, and he said no, he's been a durable player for us, and he kind of fought back against that notion. But look, there's that is part of the reasoning here. It has to be part of the Eagles' reasoning. The other thing that we haven't, I think we got to get into is okay, where does AJ his feelings factor into the move as well? And yeah, I think it's very clear. He sent a parting message on Instagram thanking Eagles fans and the team, et cetera. Didn't say why. I don't expect him to do, and maybe at some point he will. But it's right there. This is all right there in front of us. I mean, he's been essentially unhappy. He won his Super Bowl. He said, the question I asked him right before the start of training, or at the start of training camp, it's like, hey, you've accomplished this. You won the Super Bowl. You've been there twice. You've got all pros. You're considered one of the best receivers of your generation. What else is there at this stage of your career? And he's like, essentially, Hall of Fame, legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And this offense, I guess he views it, and the quarterback, Jalen Hurts, in part, he views that as kind of keeping him from reaching the Hall of Fame, perhaps, or cementing that legacy. We'll see what happens in New England, and if he can kind of reach that with a very young quarterback and whatever else they got going on there. Do you think that AJ was valid in wanting to move on at this stage of his career?
I think he was. I mean, look, I think everything that he was thinking and feeling inside, and that on more than one occasion leaked out to the outside. I think it's all perfectly human and something that frankly any one of us might feel if we were in the same position. First things first. Like don't get anything twisted. Like this guy was a warrior, you know. Like he gave everything he had to the Eagles. You know, he played all 17 games his first 2 years and then missed I think 5 games the last couple of years. But he played as many snaps as anybody in the National Football League, and while he allowed his frustration at times, you know, to get to him, you know, in the grand scheme of wide receivers, you know, he was pretty close to a model camper,
Yeah, top 5 guy.
you know, and look, he's my only point with the injury stuff and the durability stuff is he is right on the precipice of where guys like him, you know, go downhill. I mean, Julio Jones was great at 29, was a little less great at 30, and then barely cracked 1,000 receiving yards for the rest of his career combined. You know, DeAndre Hopkins, you know, guys like once you lose that, you know, the guys who are at that elite tier, they had that like just something extra 10% that nobody else has. And that extra 10% is kind of the first thing to go, you know, and once you lose that, you lose some of what made you, you know, worth $30 million a year. So yeah, I think the Patriots are making this deal thinking like, look, we think we're going to get 2 very
2
good years out of him. And I
Yeah.
think that's more than enough when you look at the receiving core that they have had. And to answer your original question, yeah, I mean, look, if you watch Drake May play quarterback, every wide receiver in the National Football League is going to think, man, put this way, every wide receiver on about 20 teams is going to think, man, if this guy was throwing to me, you know, I'd light it up, you know,
They
because
watched him in the regular season.
yeah, not in the Super Bowl, obviously,
Well,
but
I think the entire postseason was kind of underperforming.
yeah, he was absolutely.
Underwhelming, excuse me.
But at the same time, part of that was due to his receiving core, you could argue as well.
True.
But that being said, you know, I would expect. I'm excited to watch these guys. I hope AJ, you know, isn't dramatically worse physically than he was last year because I can't wait. I'm a huge AJ Brown fan. I have been ever since Mississippi, you know, and I can't wait. And I'm a huge Drake May fan, and I can't wait to watch these two together. And I think look, he won a Super Bowl. It's a frustrating offense to play in, you know, for a receiver like AJ Brown, you know, because your opportunities are already limited by how often they run the ball, you know, and then you factor in the fact that the quarterback is slightly limited in his route tree and you know isn't the passer that a guy like Drake May is or Mahomes or anybody like that, you know. I think
Then you
it's perfectly understandable why AJ would be you know happy to have been here, but also happy to see what's next.
right, and I don't think the Eagles are necessarily happy to see him go, but, like, they're probably happy that they don't have to deal with this, like, drama that
And look, you
had
get a first round pick, you know.
had been building up. I don't think it's, like, as soap opera-ish as maybe on the outside, as some might believe. I do feel like there's definitely issues. There was definitely kind of, like, taking of sides in the locker room at times, and, they're 2 very different people, despite the fact that they were very close at one point, and, I think to some extent, I've talked about this, there was an airing out of grievances, and they kind of reached a point of acceptance by the end of the season. I think they'll be fine moving forward if anyone really cares at home. But, on the field, I think that's what was clearly more of the issue. And it's like, if the offense is going to be changing schematically, if they're going to, like, they're really essentially bringing in another run based offense, they're just going to be doing it differently.
Mhm.
I mean, what happens if, like, AJ? I mean, Jalen's got to learn a new scheme. He's got to learn to do things differently. I mean, there's going to have to be a learning curve here. I don't know how much fans are going to be able to accept it or be comfortable with it, and we'll see how willing they're willing to go under Sean Mannion into this Shanahan McVay type West Coast scheme. But just imagine if they had kind of got off to another slow start as they did in 2024. What happens with AJ and media obligations. And
Yeah.
so I think that's part of it. I also think the Eagles kind of feel comfortable with what they have to some extent. They've been touting Devontae Smith being able to kind of get more targets and hit a higher ceiling. I think there's certainly some room for that. I don't know if we'll see how he does when they start doubling him, bracketing him like they have been AJ the last 4 years. That could affect him as well. And then you have the Mekhi Lemon draft pick. You got Eli Stowers, the tight end who came in the second round. You do have options. You have Saquon Barkley, who I think can be featured more as a pass catcher in this offense. Certainly, you factor in the run game and the offensive line, what they could do there. And Jalen is like, we're not saying, he's not good, It's just like the buddy ball that used to exist with throwing it up to AJ, no matter where he was or how he was covered. That's that element. You have some of that with Devontae Smith, but that is essentially not going to be there as much anymore. You're gonna have to scheme guys open more. What do you make of like what they have existing now on the roster? I mean, there's some question marks certainly in terms of how they're going to compensate for the loss of AJ Brown.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, look, I wrote this today. I I am a bit look. We don't know anything about Mekhi Lemon, but I he really impressed me. In the kind of limited tape sample that I watched. Devontae's great. He's a top whatever 20 wide receiver in this league. By the end of the season with Mekhi Lemon, they could again have one of the top 10 receiving tandems in the league. I mean, it's very rare to have two guys. It's just rare to have two. Look, I mean, like look at the Broncos. What did they have before Jalen Waddle? Couldn't Devontae Smith? Couldn't Devontae Smith and Mekhi Lemon be better than Cortland Sutton and one of those 7 other wide receivers that they kind of spread the ball around to? Puka and Adams, obviously you can throw out there, but it's just it's hard to have it's hard to get two guys and keep them for a long period of time, given the money that these guys make, and just not a lot of teams have it. Look at the Chargers. They have McConkey and who else? Quentin Johnson. The Patriots. Patriots might not have without AJ Brown. Patriots might not have a receiver better than either Mekhi Lemon or Devontae Smith. Now we'll see. That's a lot of it's on Lemon. I do think this is going to end up being a blessing, whether it was an unwanted blessing or a blessing in disguise or whatever. I do think that they're at a point where they're fast approaching a precipice here. Think about when that in 2028, when that first round pick hits. Is Lane Johnson going to be still playing NFL football? Jalen Hurts is going to be 30, and he's going to have 2 seasons. Jalen, they could be looking for a quarterback by that. A lot depends on what happens these next couple of years. Jalen Hurts, Zach Bond's going to be 31. They're going to have all these guys, making $25-30 million a year in terms of the cornerbacks and the defensive tackle. Who knows with Landon Dickerson. So, I don't know that it's a bad thing that first round pick is not going to hit until 2028, because they really need to at some point they're going to really have to hit on guys. I mean, Saquon, is Saquon going to have 3 more years left in his body? So I think, yeah, I think so. So both in terms of return and what they have, I think receiver, I think that you're not going to find a big possession receiver who does the things like AJ Brown. We've seen it once, with the Eagles in terms of Terrell Owens. There just aren't tons of guys out there. But I think receiver, they're just about. I mean, they need a tight end. They still need a tight end, and that would be the one argument, for kind of ruining the fact that the pick is not next year, because that to me is one of the biggest positions of concern, because that's a sneaky hard. What's that? Well, we'll see we'll see if he's a 3rd round pick or whatever he was. Second round. So yeah, I mean, we'll see. I think that a lot can happen over these next few years, and all we know is AJ Brown was probably not going to be here at some point within that time. And the fact that they're now getting a first round pick that can help them prepare for life, kind of Jalen Hurts 2.0, I think that's going to turn out to be a good thing, because look, they weren't good enough last year with AJ Brown, and I'm not sure how much better the roster is, and we'll see.
Well, that was my question to Howie Roseman at the owners meeting. Is like, okay, an offense that was not good last year for the most part in the latter third in terms of most rankings. You were at that point, you're basically bringing back 10 of 11 starters, I believe. And I think what we're seeing since then is Howie kind of addressing that and resetting as much as he can, with not only with the AJ Brown trade, with who they drafted with the first 3 picks, a wide receiver, a tight end, and a tackle. And that's why I think what we're seeing here, when you talk about a precipice, I think this is going to be, I hate to say it on Jalen Hurts, because it's like, yeah, it always is that way. There's always pressure, but like, this is what they're saying to some extent, because there are going to be other guys that they're going to have to moving on from at some point. Lane Johnson, maybe Landon Dickerson, Saquon Barkley. It's like Jalen's contract isn't extended in terms of dollars beyond this year, and he is not coming off his best year. In fact, it was a regression in some respects. So like, where does he fit into, the future? I just don't think that it's I think it's a fair question to pose. He's a franchise quarterback, but next offseason will be interesting if this year there isn't as much advancement as the Eagles would like as he's nearing the age of 30. And I think that's the big issue right now moving forward. It's all about Jalen Hurts. I will say one thing, Dave, before I let you go, and we cut this short because we wanted to give people a reaction pod. There's this kind of theory out there that like Mike Vrabel and AJ Brown, there's tampering and they helped manufacture this deal, and this is something that the Eagles should be upset about. And the fact that the Eagles agreed to this trade basically just disqualifies that notion. Howie Roseman was asked about it and said, no, obviously I'm not making any accusations. And why would he? He wanted to make the trade. So
Yeah.
like to me, that's just kind of a ludicrous. In fact, they probably encouraged it to some respects because they wanted to get the deal done. They wanted this done as well. They found some sort of common ground and made it happen. And, we can speculate all we want about this, that, or the other thing. There's a lot to play out here over the next few years, and we'll see how it plays out. But
Yeah, I'm with you on the whole conspira theorizing, however you want to call it. That it was that was yeah. It's not even worth bringing up, but it was the off season in Philadelphia, and something's got to vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so do radio airwaves and the human mind, I guess.
Yeah, well, I brought it up because I felt there's certainly some questions out there, and I thought it needed to be answered. But Dave, thank you so much for joining us. Talk to you soon.
All right, bud.